So round 3 of the World Championship match between Magnus Carlsen and Nepomniachtchi. Nepo was white in this game and played e4. Magnus went e5 like in game 1. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, a6. The players repeating moves from game 1 up until this point. Now in game 1, Nepo played h3 and Magnus sacrificed the e5 pawn with knight a5. But in this game, Nepo tried a4, which is another popular anti-martial system, which I should make a comment about a little bit here, because how is this move preventing the martial system? So let's say black plays d5 in this position, which is attempting to go into the martial. Well, in this case, white can, instead of taking here, he can just take this pawn, because black cannot take, because if this happens, then rook takes rook, right? So he has to take here, but then white can simply take this knight here, and after pawn takes, queen takes pawn. There's not anything special that black has gained from this variation, and white's doing quite well here. So immediately d5 is not a possibility. So black has to deal with this threat of pawn takes pawn, and the most obvious way of dealing with that is to play bishop to b7, which is what Magnus did, because now this rook is protected. Okay, so d3 was played by Nepo, and now again here black can actually play d5, which was played by Magnus himself against Fabiano Caruana in 2017, and that game went e takes d5, knight takes, and Caruana played knight bd2, so he played it a little slow. But I think that in this position, white can play ab5, as was played, for example, by Ray Robson against Duriar Bailey in 2018. And after takes, bishop takes, knight takes pawn, and knight d4, he goes for this bishop, but knight bd2. And yes, black has some play, but it's not, to me at least, it doesn't look as strong as the play black gets in a normal martial system. So this is obviously a better position for white. So Magnus did not go for d5. He went for the more sane line d6 in this position. Okay, Nepo went knight b to d2. And here Magnus played a slightly rare move, but it has been played before. He played rook to e8, which it's hard to make sense of this move immediately, because the e file is not an open file. Plus, this pawn on f7 is looking a little bit loose right now, because this bishop is already targeting that. So it could get tactically dangerous to move this rook here. Although there's nothing immediate, bishop takes f7, king takes knight g5, black simply goes king g8, and there is no knight e6 in the position. Black just plays queen d7. However, what happens if, let's say, black goes knight g5 to attack this pawn? Well, first of all, black could simply play rook f8 and offer a draw. And if white goes knight f3, then black can play rook e8, and white could actually play knight g5. And if black's happy to take the draw, he can take, well, black has to, black can play d5, but rook f8, and it could be drawn that way. But I think a stronger move here for black is to just play d5. Because now white, after he takes, black can play knight d4, hitting this bishop here. And that leads to some interesting complications, which don't favor white. At the most, they give him a level position. So let's see what happens if white takes the pawn on e5. So how many pawns is white up? Black has 6 pawns, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. White has 2 pawns extra for the moment. But black has tremendous counterplay in this position. For example, if queen d7 here, that's a engine move. Knight takes d5 is another perfectly fine move, but queen d7, let's go with what the engine recommends. We'll see the point of it soon. So now black here is threatening knight g4 in this position to hit this guy, and then also open the bishop on g5. So that's something that white has to be careful about. So let's say white in this position plays a really bad move, f4. you may say, well, okay, he's defending the rook, he's defending the knight, so this move seems to do the job. But now knight g4 hits this rook. He has to move, so let's say rook e1. And now bishop c5. And there is no good defense against the discovered check that's coming with this knight. If the king moves, then, well, knight f2 check, and you lose your queen. But if you don't move the king, then how are you going to defend against this knight jumping virtually anywhere and giving a discovered check? There is no defense to that. So f4 is not working. How about h3? We stop knight g4 because that was the point. In this case, white can play knight takes b3, or black can play knight takes b3. And after knight takes, well, first of all, he takes one pawn here. And after white escapes, bishop takes d5, he takes another pawn back. So he's equalized. And white's knight is not exactly in the best position. And black has the two bishops. So this would not be a favorable position for white to go into. Let's look at another line here with a takes b5. White says, okay, I don't want to lose this pawn here, so I'm going to take, you can play your knight g4 move. And after rook g4, you can take this guy because I've got rook takes knight here. But black here has knight takes pawn. And if, of course, king takes and bishop e3 check wins this rook. So he has to move this queen. And now black's best option is to go for a draw with bishop e3. Because now he's threatening discovered checks with knight moving somewhere. So white hits this guy with knight f3. And now black has to take the draw with check, double check, king h1, check, and draw. So these are some really interesting lines that could happen with knight g5, which I'm sure Magnus was prepared for. So he was not worried about this move, knight g5. There's one more line that I wanted to show you here, because if he doesn't take on e5 and goes bishop a2, then there's bishop takes d5 simply. And after takes here, take here, take here. And this is a really nice position with knight d7 now hitting this rook and also hitting this knight. So he has to play rook d5 to attack this guy in return. And now black simply drops him back with knight c6, saying, what are you going to do about this guy? Because now next I'm going knight b4 and forking your two rooks. So really amazing variations there with knight g5. Okay, anyway, knight g5 was not played. Knight f1 was played, so he's trying to reroute his knight either this way or that way, depending on how the game proceeds. So one of the points of rook e8 was to be able to move this bishop back to f8 so that the knight on c6 could be brought to e7. The other point of rook e8 is to have some indirect pressure on this e file. So if, let's say, white ever goes d4, then these pawns would come off, and then the e4 pawn would be slightly weak, and that rook is already eyeing that. Plus, he could additionally have an extra defense on e5 if white pawn goes here and he's not able to take immediately. So that's some rationale behind this move, rook e8. But now if he goes bishop f8 immediately, then white has bishop g5, which puts this knight in a pin. And it gets annoying to deal with this knight. For example, if h6, then white can simply play bishop h4 and say, I'm not trading it yet. I'm just going to make life miserable for you. And if black gets annoyed with that pin and plays a move like g5, then white can in fact just take bishop takes g5. And now with moves like rook e3 and rook g3, white has a free attack. Plus, he could also have moves like knight e3 and knight f5. And the bishop's already pointing here. So white's forces are quite mobilized for an attack on black's king. So this would not be favorable. There's also another interesting possibility I saw here of simply taking and taking like this. Is not the best line, but still it shows you that white's position has a lot of options here. Bishop d5 pins this knight to this guy. So black defends that bishop with rook b8 and now take. And white can play knight e3. He still has to solve this problem, so knight d8, but then take, and now a move like rook a8 pins this knight to that guy. And you can see that white's position is far more comfortable to play than black's position. So for all of these reasons, Magnus first played h6 to stop that bishop g5 move. Plus, he's also stopping any knight g5 ideas, and now he can think about how to develop the other pieces or maneuver his other pieces. So bishop d2 was played by Nepo. So he's watching this square a5 and not allowing his knight to come here to a5 to cause some problems to this bishop, potentially knight a5 and pawn to c5. So he's taking away that possibility and asks Magnus, okay, what are you going to do in this position? But this has all been played before, so it's not as if Magnus is seeing this for the first time. So bishop f8, knight e3 from Nepo. Kasparov in this position in 2001 against Tkachiev played c4, and that led to a really interesting game. Pawn takes, bishop takes, rook b8, bishop c3, knight e7, as you can see, knight g3, knight g6, d4. This is very typical of Kasparov to play like this with all his pieces well coordinated and now pushing in the center. Although here Tkachiev could have hit him with knight takes pawn, and after knight takes d5, the engine analysis shows that black would have equalized easily after knight takes pawn, pawn takes, knight takes here, and rook takes, and it's easy to see that pieces have come off and we are most likely going to head into a bishops of opposite color endgame with knight takes f8, and that's going to be easily drawn for black. But Tkachiev played e takes d4, pretty natural, but that simply allows white to move freely with queen takes d4. And after d5, e takes, knight takes, he was still okay, but white has some pressure with rook d1. So he has to defend this guy with knight f4. And then white increases slightly the pressure with knight f5. Tkachiev goes queen f6, and now he trades and he's created this weakness on f6. Still, it's not the end of the game, and black, if with perfect play, can still hold this. But in a practical game, it becomes difficult, especially when you're facing an opponent of the caliber of Garry Kasparov. So Tkachiev immediately started going wrong here with bishop c8, knight e3 takes, and he lost this pawn and went on to lose that game. So that's what Kasparov played. But Nepo in this position played knight e3. There's no need to rush to play c4, so you can first improve the position of your piece and then think about playing c4. So knight e7, and now c4 from Nepo. Here, okay, white is at least threatening to take on b5 and win a pawn, even though it's not that significant, but black has to deal with something with that threat. He just cannot allow an extra pawn like that, even if it's not that significant. It is still a small advantage for white, so he has to deal with that threat. Pawn takes a4 would not be good, because then bishop takes a4, and this pawn is weak, and plus white is already controlling the a file, so that's not a good position to go into. Pawn b4 would just lose the pawn, although bishop takes a5, bishop c3, and c5, and black could close everything and say, well, your pawn on b2 is not really a significant pawn, and this is all locked up, so how are you going to make progress? Obviously, it's only white who is playing to win here, so I don't see any reason for Magnus to go into this sort of a line. So that leaves pawn takes pawn, which is what Magnus did. And now knight takes from Nepo. So his idea with knight e3 to c4 is shown after playing c4, after playing knight e3 first and then c4. Okay. Now he is threatening to go knight a5 and make life difficult for this bishop on b7. So Magnus played knight c6, holding that a5 square. And Nepo improved the position of his rook to c1 and adds some pressure down the c line. Now this is a really interesting position. First of all, what were the alternatives? Knight a5 could be played, but then take, bishop takes, and queen d7. And now if rook c1, then black goes c5. And sure, he's got a hole here on d5, but black also, or white also has a hole here on d4. So it's an equal position. So rook c1 was played instead, keeping the tension alive and asking Magnus, okay, what are you going to do? Let's say Magnus had played a move like queen d7, then white had an interesting idea up his sleeve of playing pawn to a5. And now he's going to play bishop to a4 and create a threat down this diagonal. So that's going to be really annoying. So to prevent that, black has to play knight to a7 so he can meet bishop a4 with a move like bishop to c6 and cancel him out. But the fact that this knight is here on a7 can be exploited by white to do something on the right side of the board, because this guy is offside. So while he's offside, let us do something either in the center or towards the right hand side of the board, so that black is effectively down a piece for a move or two, and white can get play with a move like bishop c3, for example. Now if black is not careful and he plays a move like rook to b8, thinking, okay, I've got the open file here, then white can hit him with bishop takes pawn, take, and knight takes. And now hits the queen, also hits f7. And if queen b5, then bishop takes, pawn check, king, let's say h8, knight g6 check, king h7, and pawn to e5. You can see that white's forces are just easily moving in the direction of black's king. The rook's hitting c7, knight could potentially jump to g5 with check, and queen h5 next move. So this is absolutely lost for black. So that's the idea with that's the threat with playing a5 and bishop a4. So how do you deal with that? So Magnus here made a really interesting decision. He played with what was probably the best move in the position. After thinking for a lot of time, he played a5, saying you're not getting a5 yourself. But this is an extremely committing move, because this pawn on a5 is a weakness, and white already got a knight and a bishop aiming at that. So that means that black's knight and rook are already tied to the defense of this pawn. And if only white can get an extra attacker on this guy, that pawn's going to be lost. So that's the tension in the position. So Nepo tried to get bishop c3 here, and so he can play queen d2 next and then start targeting that pawn on a5. And Magnus played an excellent move that stunned Nepo, but that was the best move in the position. Again, bishop back to c8, temporarily leaving this knight unprotected. But his point is that between this rook and this knight, there's two pieces, and he cannot move both at once. But the main point, of course, is to counter this guy with a move like bishop to e6. And once this guy is here to oppose him, he is completely neutralized. And Magnus realizes that once this guy is neutralized, his position is much safer. So Nepo played d4. Well, let's look at queen d2 first, because we want to target the a5 pawn, but then bishop e6 also solves that problem, because now if knight takes, then takes here, then rook takes the pawn. So that was an amazing way of solving the problem of the pawn on a5. So Nepo instead played d4. And after takes, knight takes, this knight is loose, so he has to take, queen takes d4, and it's similar to the Kasparov game. Except that white had a knight here on g3. And now Magnus followed up with bishop e6. And he's equalized the position. Because now if knight takes a5, then as we have seen, well, first of all, pawn to c5, not bishop takes. He can play pawn to c5, hits the queen, and now he's threatening rook takes knight. So he has to go here. And after take, rook. Well, rook takes a4 was on, but knight takes e4 is even stronger. So this is not working in white's favor at all. If, let's say, knight d2, which is a line that they discussed in the press conference, then d5, and then take, bishop takes with the queen, trades, takes here, takes there, takes this pawn. Black will play rook a8 while they take that pawn, then rook takes a4, bishop e5 now, f6, and this is as far as Magnus saw, and he realized that there is nothing that white has in this position. Despite the extra pawn, black has the two bishops, and that is enough for him to hold the balance in this position. So he was not afraid of this line. And the same thing happens if a move like bishop c2 is played. Then again d5. This move d5 is the key move in this position, and it solves all of black's problems. Because if e5, then dc take, and rook takes d8, and a similar position to that which happened in the game. An improvement that could be suggested is queen d3, which is moving this queen away from this threat of pawn to c5, and now it is threatening a5. But even so, black can play d5, and after takes, knight takes, bishop takes a5, sure, but knight b4, and black will swap off the queens and create the threat of knight d3 in this position, which forces him to take. And with these two bishops and the weaknesses of a4 and b2, white is unable to get anything out of it, because it's too hard to coordinate white's pieces against black's two bishops here, and including these weaknesses. So this is pretty level also. So Nepo saw all of this probably and just decided to play a move like h3, just creating a flight square for his king and asking Magnus, okay, what are you going to do in this position? Now d5, as we have seen, was possible already in this position, but Magnus decided, why not wait and just make it a little more complicated with c6 and see if I get anything out of it. Now Nepo played bishop c2, and here black has to play d5, because if he plays a careless move like, let's say, queen c7, then white prevents d5 with the move queen d3, because now if d5 then take, and if you take, then bishop takes knight, and you're threatening queen h7 mate, so you've just won a piece, and it's game over. So queen d3 is a nice move in this position, and it solves white's problems and creates a lot of pressure on black. Now he's threatening bishop takes knight, followed by pawn to e5, and opening up this line to checkmate. So black's position is really uncomfortable here. So Magnus could not further delay d5, so he played d5, and now white, if he takes, well, then knight takes, and he swaps off this bishop, and that is a level position. So Nepo went for e5, but then pawn takes, and then queen takes here, and this bishop is really strong, so Magnus had to trade him out with bishop b4, and now the game goes into this endgame position with take, and take. White has 3 pawns here on the king side, black has 2. So theoretically speaking, if white is able to trade off all of these pieces, including the bishops, then this would be a winning endgame for white with the 3 versus 2 majority. But it's easier said than done, and black can always prevent this bishop from being traded off in the position, and he can hold the balance, as Magnus showed. So Nepo played here king f1, seeing that he had nothing immediate. For example, if he played rook b1, then black has rook d2, and now he has to worry about this guy. So bishop e4, say, but bishop d5 takes, and black has in fact solved the problem of his backward c pawn, and c3 is weak, so that compensates for any weaknesses that black has in the position. So that's not happening. So he has to prevent rook d2. So he plays king f1, because now if rook d2, then he can simply play rook d1, and if rook d8, then he can play, well, he can just take and play king e1 and push him back, and then play rook b1 or rook b1 or rook d1 and play for an advantage. So Magnus instead played rook b8, and after rook b1, Magnus says, okay, you can swap off rooks, I'm just going to centralize my king, and there's nothing in the position. White has to be, in fact, a little careful. If he gets aggressive with f4, then black can hit him with rook takes rook, Rook takes and bishop f5. Now he has to trade this guy, and that creates a weakness on d3 with rook d3 coming, and plus king f5, king takes f4. So white has to be careful and cannot play a move like f4 in this position. So Nepo instead traded rooks and played rook b1, and Magnus could have played rook d8, but he saw the endgame and he realized that white does not have anything, so he just played rook takes rook, bishop takes, king e5, centralized his king, and black is holding this position. King e2, and now f5, a really nice idea to play f4 next move and shut out all of white's ideas to get a pass pawn. Because if he plays passively, let's say he plays a move like bishop d7, and white can go king e3, and now white can start pushing with f4 and g4. The engine says black can still hold the draw here, but it's easier said than done for a human being. And what Magnus did was absolutely the best thing from a human perspective, which is f5. Because now if king e3, then well, you just hit him with f4, and if bishop c2, then f4 anyway. And now white's king cannot come here to f3 because of bishop d5 check, and g2 is falling. So that's always a problem for white. And he cannot play g3 because bishop takes h3. So white cannot make any progress on this side. And therefore Nepo just decided to repeat moves and even played f3, h4, and the game was drawn. At the press conference, it was revealed that Lichess, the Stockfish N14 NU engine that Lichess uses, revealed that this game is the most accurate game played in a World Championship match, and Magnus was quite proud of that when he heard it. And as you can see, when chess is played accurately, it results in a draw as far as we know. And even though that's not the result that we want to see, we do want to see players play really good chess, which is what both players did in this case, and the game was drawn. So I think that's the perfect conclusion to game 3.